Hello and welcome back, guys. So in this particular session, what we'll be doing is that we'll be looking at SPL's exam kit, question number 13, JPT. Okay, so as you can see in your screen, we've been given this particular question. So what does the question basically say? JPT in the 2000 X9 results presentation to analyst, the chief executive of JPT, a global internet communication company, announced an excellent set of results to the waiting audience. Okay, results presentation to analyst. The chief executive of JPT, a global internet communication company, announced an excellent set of results to the waiting audience. Chief Executive Clive Shue announced that compared to 2008, sales has increased by 50%, profit by 100%, total assets by 80%. Okay, sales has increased by 50. Where did the other 50 come from then? Internet communication company, right? The dividend was to be doubled from the previous year. You also announced that based on their outstanding performance, the chief executive directors will be paid large bonus in line with their contracts. His own bonus as chief executive would be 20 million. When one of the analysts asked if the bonus was excessive, Mr. Shu reminded the audience that the share price had increased 45% over the course of the year because of its efforts in skillfully guiding the company. He said he expected the share price to rise further on the results announcement, which it duly did. Because the results exceeded market expectation, the share rose another 25% to 52, right? Okay. 3 months later, Shu called a press conference to announce a restatement of 20X9 results. This was necessary because he said because of some regrettable accounting errors. Okay, 3 months later, right? That's why sales has increased by 50, and then how your profit has increased by 100%, right? There should be some other kind of income which is adding it up. This followed a meeting between JPT and the legal authorities who were investigating a possible fraud. He disclosed that, in fact, the figures of 2001 were increase of 10% for sales, 20% for profits. Okay, so it was only 40% growth, right? Profit 80%, asset 25% only, right? Which were significantly below market expectations. The proposed dividend would now only be a modest 10% more than last year. He said that he expected a market reaction to the restatement but hoped that it would only be short-term effect. He said he expected a market reaction to the restatement but hoped that it would only be a short-term effect. Okay. The first questioner from the audience asked why the auditors had not spotted and corrected the fundamental accounting errors. And second questioner asked whether such a disparity between initial and restated results was due to fraud rather than accounting errors. When a journalist asked Cliff Shue if he intended to pay back 20 million bonus that had been based on previous year's results, Mr. Shue said he did not. The share price fell dramatically upon the restatement announcement, and because JPT was a large company, it made headline in the business pages in many countries. Later that month, the company announced that following an internal investigation, there would be further restatements, all dramatically downward for the year 20x6 and 20x7. This caused another mass selling of JPT shares, resulting in a final sale value of the following day of $1 share. This represented a loss of shareholder value of 12 billion from the peak share price. Cliff Shoe resigned and the government regulator for the business ordered an investigation into what had happened at Chipiri. The shares were suspended by stock exchange a month later, having failed to gain protection from its creditors in the court. Chipiri was declared bankrupt. Okay, nothing was paid to the shareholders, whilst suppliers received a fraction of the amount due to them. Some non-current assets were acquired by competitors, but all of GPT's 50,000 employees lost their jobs, mostly with little or no termination penalties. Because the JPT employees' pension fund was not protected from creditors, the value of that was also severely reduced to pay debts, which meant that employees with many years of service would have a greatly reduced pension to rely on in old age, right? Reduced pension. That is very bad, right? The government investigation found that GPT had been maintaining false accounting records for the several years. This was done by developing an overly complicated company structure that contained a network of international branches and business model that was difficult to understand. Whereas GPT had begun as a simple telecommunication company, Cliff Shoe had increased high losses and misreport profits. In the company's reporting, he also substantially overstated the value of future customer supply contracts. He also substantially overestimated the value of future customer supply contracts. Okay, so revenue, right? The investigation also found a number of significant internal control deficiencies, including no effective management oversight of the external reporting process and disregard of relevant accounting standard. Okay, this is very significant statement, right? You don't have an internal control, and then you don't have a management oversight. So the role of Perry's non-executive director, since it is a listed company, what were they doing? They had a role of scrutinizing the activities, right? Where is the audit committee? In addition to Mr. Shu, several other directors were complicit in the activities, although Sajialo, a senior qualified accountant working for the financial director, had been unhappy about the situation for some time. Okay, in addition to Mr. Shu, several other complicit. Do they are they regarding that as accomplice? Let's see, complicit. What will be the exact meaning of complicit? COMPLI. Complement, complicity, complicit, right? Involvement with other people in an unlawful activity. Okay, complies, right? Or matiar. Let's see the difference between is it actually called accomplice meaning or complice? Okay, complicit. Morally wrong, right? Okay, it's basically same thing. Not direct involvement, but supporting role, right? So I had been unhappy about the situation for some time. She had approached the finance director with her concerns, but having failed to get the answer, She felt she had threatened to tell the press that future customer supply values had been initially and materially overstated. The changes in fair value would have had a profit impact, and that's for sure. Okay, but did she have that in writing, Sazia? That's the only way she could be safe, right? As an accountant, when a crime came to the attention for the finance director, came to the attention when a threat came attention to the court, she was intimidated in the hope that she would keep quiet. She finally accepted a large personal bonus in exchange for her silence. Okay, in the late 2008, as she needed the funds for her ill mother's medical bills, the investigation later found that Sazia Low had been continually instructed against her judgment to report figures she knew to be grossly optimistic. Okay. The investigation found that the auditor JGC partnership, one of the largest in the country, had its independence compromised by a large audit fee, but also through receiving consultancy income from CPT, which is not, as per UK's corporate governance guidelines, it is to be avoided, right? Before ZPT was such an important client for JGC, it had many resources and jobs entirely committed to JPT account. It had found knowingly signed off inaccurate accounts in order to protect the management of JPT and their senior partners engaged with JPT accounts. Okay. After the investigation, JGC's other clients gradually changed auditor, also not wanting to be seen to have any connection with JGC. Accordingly, JGC's audit business has since closed down. This caused significant disturbance and upheaval in the audit industry. Sometime later, Ms. Shu argued that one of the reasons for the development of the complex GPT business model was that it was thought to be necessary to manage many risks that GPT faced in complex and turbulent business environment. What kind of complex business model? Okay, he said that a multiplicity of overseas office was necessary to address exchange rate risks. A belief challenged by some observers said it was to enable GPT port to make their internal controls and risk management less transparent. Okay, GPT case came to the attention of Robert New, a senior national legislator in the company where GPT had its head office. Okay, where GPT had its head office. Okay, that's the country. The country did not have statutory corporate governance legislation. Okay, statutory corporate governance regulation was not there, right? So, like in US, what's there? Sarbanes-Oxley, right? In UK, there is UK Corporate Governance Code, whereas in this country there wasn't any. But still, general, generally accepted rule kind of thing, right? Mr. New was furious at GPT situation because many of his voters had been badly financially affected by it. Okay. He believed that legislation was needed to ensure that a similar situation was not to happen. Mr. intends to make a brief speech in the National Legislative Assembly, and Haag has asked for your help as an external consultant to outline the case for his proposed legislation and draft some of the proposed provision. Draft the speech for Mr. New to cover the following areas: explain the importance of sound corporate governance by assessing the consequences of corporate governance failures at GPT, construct the case for mandatory external reporting of internal financial controls and risks. Case for mandatory external reporting of internal financial controls and risks. Explain the broad areas that the proposed external report on internal controls should include, drawing on the case content as appropriate. Explain the broad areas that the proposed external report on internal controls should include. Okay, let's do the first one first. Speech, importance of corporate governance. Right. CPT. Speech on okay, this does not have to be bold. A speech on importance of good governance and consequences of failure, right? Good governance and consequences of failure introduction, right? There is an gentleman. I begin my remarks today by noting that we meet at an unfortunate time for business in this country. In the wake of catastrophic collapse of GPT, one of the largest telecommunication companies, we have also had to suffer the loss of one of our large audit firms, JCC, series of events has heightened in all of us an awareness of the vulnerability of business organization management incompetencies, corruption as well, right? catastrophic collapse of GPT, one of the largest we've had to suffer the loss of one of our large audit firms, JCC. The series of events has heightened all of us of awareness of the vulnerability of business organization to management incompetencies and corruption, right? Heightened awareness of the vulnerability of business organizations. The consequences of corporate governance failures at ZPT. Right. I would therefore like to remind in this unfortunate case or corporate governance failures affect many groups and individuals, and as legislators we owe it to all of them to ensure that the highest standards of corporate governance are observed. Would have liked to remind you of this unfortunate case. Remind you I would therefore like to remind you all why corporate governance is important. I would like to remind you all why corporate governance is important, and I will do this by referring to the failures in this unfortunate case. Right. Corporate governance failures affect many groups and individuals, and as legislator, we owe it to them to ensure that highest standards of corporate governance are observed. Right. Oops. That is one thing, right? Firstly, and probably firstly effective corporate first and most probably most obviously effective corporate governance protects the value of shareholders' investment in a company. Should not forget that the majority of shareholders are not fat cats who may be able to afford large losses. Okay, we should not forget that majority of the shareholders are not fat cats, right? Who may be able to afford large losses. First thing corporate governance it does is that it basically protects the value of shareholders' investment, right? And then we should not forget that most of the majority of the shareholders are not fat cats who may be able to afford such large, rather, they are individual pension fund managers, individual pension fund members, small investors, pension fund members, and then small investors and members of mutual funds, right? The hard-working voters who save for the future have their efforts undermined by selfish and arrogant executives who deplete the value of those investments. This unfairness is allowed to happen because of lack of regulation of corporate governance in this country. So basically, it's to protect the value of the shareholders, and then they are not always the fat cats, right? Rather, they are pension fund members, or they could be small investors, or members of mutual fund, right? And the hard-working voters who save for the future have their efforts undermined by selfish and arrogant executives who deplete the resources or deplete the value of those investments. This unfairness is allowed to happen because of lack of regulation of corporate governance in this country. Okay. The second group of people who lose out after the collapse is employees, right? Collapse of CPT employees. Why is that? Because they lost their employment provident fund as well, right? Employees. Okay. So the second group of people to lose out are the employees, right? And then is no fault of theirs that their directors were so misguided, and yet it is they who bear a great deal of the cost. It is no fault of theirs that the directors were so misguided, and yet it is they who bear a great deal of cost. I should stress, of course, that jobs were lost at JCC as well as at JPT. Employment, even when temporary and fractional, is a personal, temporary, or frictional, right? Some friction, personal misery for the families affected, and it can also increase costs to the payer when state benefits considered. Unemployment, even when temporary and fictional, is a personal misery, right? Is a personal misery for the families affected, and it also increase cost to the taxpayer when state benefits are considered, right? It's very true. Thirdly, which is affected, okay, not employees, not that. Okay, thirdly will be our creditors. Collapse of JPT. Creditors have gone unpaid. Customers have remained unserviced. Creditors have gone unpaid and customers have remained unserviced, right? Creditors and customers. we should not assume suppliers can afford to lose their receivables in JPT, and for many smaller suppliers, their exposure to JPT could well threaten their own survival. We should assume that suppliers can afford to lose their receivables in JPT, and for many small suppliers, their exposure to JPT could well threaten their survival. Yup, it's very true as well. Again, we should assume that suppliers could lose their receivables. We should not assume that suppliers could lose their. We should not lose, right? They can. They may not. They may not be able to afford the loss in their receivables. And for many suppliers, their exposure to JPT could well threaten their own survival. Not assume that everyone can afford to lose their receivables, right? For many small suppliers, their exposure to JPT could well threaten their own survival, where the value of net assets is inadequate. कहाँ जाएं? क्यों जाएं? त्यसको value of net assets is inadequate. त्यस्तो केसमा त adequate to repay the full of payables, let alone share capital. There has been a failure in company direction and in corporate governance. So I hope you will the full of payables, right? Let alone share capital मात्र होइन कि यो पनि त्यो त दुर्व्यवहार हो. Company direction and in corporate governance. So there is failure in company direction and corporate governance. I hope you will agree with me that effective management and sound corporate governance are vital in such important business says is JPT and JCC has caused effective management and sound corporate governance. Effective management and sound corporate governance. Right, right. The loss of two such important business, JPT and JCC, had or has one had and it's still currently there, has caused great disturbance in the telecommunication and audit industries. Right, great disturbance Dhoni bhai ko. The telecommunication and audit industries as SEC lost its legitimacy to provide audit services, and its client moved to other auditors. Structure of the industry changed. Okay, so it has caused a great disturbance in telecommunication and audit industries. मतलब भाई को, lost its legitimacy to provide audit services, and it client moves to other and it clients move to other auditors. The structure of the industry has changed, of course, right? Because it's not no longer in the business, and other auditors will eventually be able to absorb the work previously undertaken by will eventually be able to observe the work undertaken will eventually be able to observe the work previously undertaken by GCC. Clearly, this will cause short to medium capacity issues for those firms as they redeploy resources to make good on those new contracts. This was, I should remind you, let's hide this thing. This was, I should remind you, both unnecessary and entirely avoidable. Right. Basically, they might be able to absorb it like in the long term, but it basically cause capacity issues for those firms to deploy resources to make good on those new contracts, right? Short term and medium term kind of thing issues was there. So this was basically, sorry, I should remind you, was both, this was, I should remind you, both unnecessary and avoidable as well. Yep, that's true. Linked to this point, I would remind colleagues that it is important for business in general and auditing in particular to be respected in society. The loss of auditors, the reputation caused by this events is very unfortunate, as auditing underpins our collective confidence in business reporting. Alright, and next thing is basically for business in general and auditing in particular to be respected in society. The loss of auditors' reputation caused by these events is very unfortunate, as auditing underpins our collective confidence in business reporting. It would be, so it would underpins our collective confidence in business reporting, and then it would be wholly appropriate for other auditors be affected by the behavior of JCC, or for businesses in general to be less trusted because of the events JPT, right? Basically underpins our collective confidence in business reporting, and then it would be wholly appropriate for other auditors to be affected by the behavior of JCC. It would be wholly appropriate for other auditors to be affected by JCC, and for other businesses in general to be less trusted because of the events at JPT, right? Okay. I very much hope such losses of reputation and in confidence I very much hope such loss of reputation in public will not occur. Finally, we have all been dismayed by the case of Sajia Low that was reported in the press. Lack of sound corporate governance practice places employees such as Mrs. Low in positions where she to act as a whistleblower. She would, by all accounts, have been victimized her employers. Right, lack of dismayed by the lack of corporate governance practice places in positions where she to act as a vehicle by she would, by all accounts, would have been victimized by her employers. What would have been the case? Sure. Her acceptance of what was effectively a bribe to remain silent brings shame both on Mrs. Lowe and on those who offered the money. An effective committee at JPT would have offered a potential an effective audit committee, right? That's what it's an effective audit committee at JPT would have offered a potential outlet for Mrs. Lowe's concerns and also provided a means of reviewing internal audit, and other professional services at GPT. This whole situation and would have been avoided had the directors of JPP managed the company under an effective framework of corporate governance. Offered a potential outlet. An effective audit committee at JPT would have offered a potential outlet for those concerns and also provided a means of reviewing external audit and other professional services at JPT. This whole situation could and would have been avoided had the directors of JPT. Whole situation could not have been avoided had the directors of the company effective framework of what will be considered. Could and would have been right. Could and then would have been right. These were the external reporting of internal controls, mandatory external reporting of internal controls and risks. This was very important in this particular case because they had separated a lot of complex structures and all right. Onto the external reporting of internal controls and risks. My reason for raising this as an issue is because this was one of the key issues, causes, let's say, causes of ZPT's failure, right? Failure. My first point in this regard is that disclosure allows for accountability for raising the issues. This was one of the key issues of GPT's failure, right? My first point in this regard is that disclosure allows for accountability. Had investors been aware of the internal controls, control failures, and business probity risks earlier, it may have been possible to replace the existing board before events deteriorated. Okay. So my first point in this regard is disclosures allow for accountability, and had investors been aware of the key issues of GPT's failure, right? The key issues is that this was one of the key issues of GPT's failure. My first point in this regard is that disclosure allows for accountability. Had investors been aware of the internal control failures and business probity risks earlier, it would have been they could replace the existing board before events deteriorated, right? To the extent that this sadly did, to the extent sadly did, right? In addition, however, the need to generate a report on internal controls annually will bring very welcome increased scrutiny from shareholders and others. Scrutiny is possible. In addition, however, the need to generate a report on internal control annually will bring welcome increased scrutiny from investors as well as others, right? So it is only when things are made more transparent that effective scrutiny is possible. That's a very good point. Secondly, I am firmly of the belief that more information on internal controls enhance shareholder confidence and satisfaction. It is vital that investors of confidence. More information about internal control on internal control will enhance shareholders' confidence and satisfaction. It is vital that investors have confidence in the internal controls of companies they in, invest in, and it is vital that investors have confidence in the companies they invest in, and increased know-how or increased knowledge will encourage internal control suspicion of fraud that caused the share price to collapse and the company ultimately fail. Lack of confidence in CPT's internal control and strong suspicion of fraud that caused the share price to collapse and the company to ultimately fail, right? Very true. Furthermore, compulsory external reporting on internal controls will encourage good practice inside the company. And the knowledge external reporting will basically encourage good practice in the company, the knowledge that their work will be externally reported upon and scrutinized by investors will encourage greater rigor in the IC function, internal control function, right? The knowledge that their work will be externally reported upon and scrutinized by investors will encourage great rigor in the IC function and in the audit committee. This will further increase investor confidence. Those who suggest that we should opt for a comply or basis to this issue, I would argue that this is simply too important an issue to allow companies to decide for themselves or to interpret non-mandatory guidelines. Right, so it is basically simply too important or should opt for a compliant explain basis to this issue, which is argued that it is simply too important an issue to allow company to decide for themselves. So it is very important that they should not be the one which is making the decision, right? Legislated for because otherwise those with poor internal controls will be able to avoid reporting on them. It must be legislated. Otherwise, those with poor internal controls able to will be able to avoid reporting on them, right? Specifying what should be disclosed on an annual basis. Companies will need to make the audit of internal controls an integral and ongoing part of their operations. It is to the contents of an internal control report that are now done. Content of external reports on internal control, right? That is what we should be discussing about now. Content as appropriate. So what should be the content of external report on internal controls? I am unable in a speech such as this to go into detail of what I would like to see in an external on internal controls. But in common with corporate governance codes elsewhere, there are broad themes that such a report should contain. The first thing being, firstly, the report should contain a statement of acknowledgement by the board that it is responsible for the company's system of internal control and for reviewing its effectiveness. Four broad themes. First is acknowledgement that the board is responsible for the company's system of internal control and its effectiveness. And then this might seem obvious, but has been shown to be an important starting point in recognizing responsibility. It is only when board accepts and acknowledges this responsibility that the impetus for the collection of data and the authority of for changing internal systems is provided a tone from the top. It's very important. and post reporting changes. And so this is a very necessary component of the report. Secondly, the report should summarize the processes or, where applicable, to its committees. Has applied in reviewing Secondly, the report should summarize the processes the board or where through its committees has applied in reviewing the effectiveness of the system of internal control, right? This may or may not satisfy shareholders. To strengthen this and how it is reviewing the effectiveness of internal control, right? Process which has been applied here for reviewing the effectiveness of internal control system. Thirdly, the report should provide meaningful, high level information that does not give a misleading impression. Clearly, internal auditing would greatly increase the reliability of this information, but a robust and effective audit committee also be very helpful. Finally, the report should contain information Finally, the report should contain information about any sorry, weaknesses in internal control that have resulted in error or material losses. Should provide information about any weaknesses in control which has basically caused a problem or material losses, right? This could have been a highly material disclosure in the case of JPT, and the costs of non-disclosure of this were a major concern or major cause of the eventual collapse of the company. Very much hope this brief remarks have been helpful in persuading leagues to consider the need for increased corporate governance legislation. Thank you for listening, right? Persuading colleagues to consider the need for increased corporate governance legislation. Yep, that should be it. All right, guys, that's pretty much it. Right, for the for this particular question. So I'll see you in the next question. Until that time, have a good one. Take care. Bye bye.